The bombardment had been running for 11 days. Not continuously. That was the thing about it that the colony's survivors would later struggle to describe to people who had not been there, because the word bombardment implied something sustained, and the thing they had experienced was not sustained in the sense of being constant, but was sustained in the sense of being inevitable. The way weather was sustained, arriving and retreating and arriving again, with the specific patience of something that did not need to hurry because hurrying was not the point. The point was attrition. The Valeth Dominion's strategic doctrine for colonial reduction operations used a specific term for what they were doing to the human settlement on Keth 7. The term translated approximately as managed pressure, which was the doctrine's language for the application of sufficient force at sufficient regularity to produce the psychological and logistical conditions for capitulation without the resource expenditure of full military engagement. Managed pressure worked by making continuation more costly than stopping. It had worked on 14 previous colonial reduction operations in the Dominion's recent history. The colony on Keth 7 had not stopped. Commander Veth Undar had been in orbital command of the reduction operation for 11 days and had, across those 11 days, revised his assessment of the situation 3 times. The first revision had come on day 3 when the colony's response to the initial bombardment had not been the response the managed pressure doctrine predicted, which was the emergence of communication through official channels indicating willingness to discuss terms. The second revision had come on day 6, when a second escalation of the bombardment had produced the same non-response. The third revision had come on day 9, when a strike on the colony's primary power generation facility had been repaired within 18 hours, using methods that Undar's technical assessment team described as improvised, creative, and not in any engineering manual we have encountered. He was sitting with the fourth revision when his monitoring officer said, "Commander, something is happening on the surface." Undar said, "Define something." The monitoring officer said, "Audio signal, coming from the colony's central settlement. The signal is not encrypted. It is not on a communication frequency. It is being broadcast on the open audio band." Undar said, "What is it?" The monitoring officer said, "It is music, Commander." Undar said, "Repeat that." The monitoring officer said, "The colony's survivors are broadcasting music on the open audio band. It appears to be live, not a recording, live performance." Undar looked at his tactical display. The tactical display showed the colony as it had looked for 11 days, which was damaged in the specific pattern that 11 days of managed pressure produced, which was systematically and increasingly, structures gone or compromised, power fluctuating, the visible evidence of a settlement being reduced toward the point where reduction was complete. And in the center of it, in the area the settlement's residents called the plaza, which the monitoring system showed as a cleared space that had been used for community gatherings before the bombardment, and that had not been used for much since, a cluster of heat signatures. People, not taking cover, not running, not doing any of the things that the managed pressure doctrine described as the behavioral indicators of a population under appropriate stress. Standing in the plaza, making music. Undar said, "Audio put it through." The audio came through. The monitoring officer had said music, and the word was accurate, but the word was also insufficient, in the same way that the word bombardment had been accurate but insufficient. It was music in the sense that it was organized sound produced by human voices, and whatever instruments the colony had available after 11 days of managed pressure. It was also something that Undar, who had been in military command for 23 years, and who was not a being given to subjective assessments in operational contexts, found immediately and unexpectedly difficult to characterize in the clinical language that operational contexts required. He listened. The voices were not performing precision. They were not producing the technically refined output of trained musicians in ideal conditions. What they were producing was the sound of a significant number of people making sound together, not perfectly, not uniformly, in the way that groups of people made sound together, when the making of it was more important than the perfection of it. The song had no words at first. It was a melody, carried by many voices, shaped by the specific acoustic properties of an open plaza on a planet with a certain atmospheric composition, reaching the monitoring system and through it the orbital command ship, and through the speakers of the command bridge. Then the words came in. Andar's translation implant rendered them. He listened to the rendered words. He said nothing for a long moment. His senior officer, a veteran named Thessaly, who had been in the Dominion's military for 15 years, and who had served under Andar for 6 of them, and who had developed across 6 years the specific skill of reading what Andar was processing from the outside of his processing, watched him. She said quietly, "Commander." He said, "Hold the next strike sequence." She said, "The sequence is scheduled for 400. He said, "Hold it." She said, "Yes, Commander." He listened to the music. It lasted 47 minutes. At the end of 47 minutes, the plaza's heat signatures dispersed, and the audio signal stopped, and the colony on Keth 7 returned to the visual silence of a settlement, doing what settlements under managed pressure did, which was continuing to exist despite the conditions designed to prevent it. Andar said, "Pull the settlement's full cultural file, everything we have on the Keth 7 colony, history, demographics, community records, everything." His intelligence officer said, "Commander, we have a standard colonial profile. It is not extensive." Andar said, "What does it have on the colony's history?" The intelligence officer pulled the profile. The colony on Keth 7 had been established 23 years ago, 412 original settlers. Current estimated population before the reduction operation began was 1,107. Primary economic function was mining and mineral processing. Standard colonial infrastructure. Standard community development arc. The profile had a cultural notes section that had been filled in by the Intelligence Division's Colonial Assessment Team, and that ran to 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the colony's governance structure. The second paragraph said, "The Keth 7 colony maintains a notably strong community culture. Communal gatherings are frequent and well attended. The colony's records indicate a tradition of communal music performance that predates the colony itself and appears to have been brought from Earth and other established human settlements. The tradition appears to be central to the colony's community identity." Andar read the second paragraph twice. He said, "The tradition predates the colony." His intelligence officer said, "That is what the profile indicates, Commander." He said, "They brought it with them." She said, "From Earth apparently, yes." He said, "They established a colony 23 years ago, and the first thing they brought was a communal music tradition." She said, "It appears to have been a founding cultural practice." Yes. He sat with that. He thought about the managed pressure doctrine and the 14 previous colonial reductions, and the behavioral indicators and the capitulation timeline, and everything that 11 days of the doctrine had and had not produced. He said, "What does the music mean? Culturally, what is the function of it in human communities?" The intelligence officer said, "I do not have a specialist on human cultural practices on this vessel, Commander. I can run a database search." He said, "Run it." The database search took 14 minutes. It returned a substantial result because the Conclave's database on human cultural practices was the product of 42 years of Earth's membership and was more extensive than most similar databases, though not as extensive as it might have been given the extent of what was in the Cultural Exchange Protocol Q. The intelligence officer compiled a summary. She said, Communal music performance in human communities has multiple documented functions. The research literature is not fully consistent on which functions are primary, but the significant documented functions include the following. She said social bonding. Communal music performance produces neurochemical responses in human participants that are associated with social bonding and group cohesion. The research indicates that groups that engage in communal music performance demonstrate higher levels of mutual trust, cooperation, and collective identity than comparable groups that do not. She said, emotional regulation. The production of music provides a mechanism for processing and expressing emotional states that might otherwise produce dysfunctional behavioral outcomes. The research indicates that music is used across human cultures as a tool for managing grief, fear, anger, and other intense emotional states. She said, identity expression. Communal music traditions carry and transmit cultural identity across generations. The specific songs, rhythms, and styles of a community encode information about that community's history, values, and self-understanding. She said, there is a fourth function that appears in the research literature, specifically in relation to communities under stress. Andar said, what function? She said, the research literature describes communal music performance under conditions of threat or hardship as a mechanism for demonstrating continued existence and collective will. Multiple historical accounts from Earth's pre-contact period describe communities under siege, occupation, or threat, using communal music as a way of communicating to both their own members and to external parties that the community persists. She said, the external communication aspect is documented specifically. There are historical accounts of communities under bombardment, siege, or occupation using music to signal to the attacking party that the community was not broken. She said, the signaling was not primarily strategic. It was not a negotiating tactic. It was a statement of fact. The community is still here. The community is still itself. Andar said, still itself. She said, that is the language the research literature uses. Yes. He looked at the tactical display. At the colony. At the plaza where 400 and more people had stood in the open and made music for 47 minutes while an orbital reduction operation held in the sky above them. He said, what do they know about us? About Valith physiology, about our sensory experience. The intelligence officer said, the colony's population is civilian, mining and processing workers and their families. They would have access to the standard public conclave database on Valith biology. He said the standard public database, which includes what? She said, basic species information, physiological characteristics, the documented range of Valith sensory perception. He said, which includes our acoustic range. She said, yes, Commander. He said, they know we can hear the music. She said, the public database would tell them that Valith acoustic perception covers the full frequency range of human vocal music. Yes. He said, they know we can hear it and they broadcast it on the open audio band. She said, yes. Andar looked at the tactical display for a long time. He thought about 47 minutes of music from a colony that had not capitulated in 11 days of managed pressure, that had capitulated 14 colonies before it. He thought about the research literature's description of communal music as a signal that the community is still here, still itself. He thought about standing in the open while the orbital reduction operation held in the sky. He thought about the first thing they brought when they established a colony 23 years ago. He thought about what it meant that the thing they had brought first was not a tool or a weapon or a protocol, but a way of being together. He said, Thessaly. Thessaly said, Commander. He said, the managed pressure doctrine, the behavioral indicators for capitulation. She said, yes. He said, does it account for this? She did not answer immediately. She looked at the tactical display. She said, "No, Commander." He said, "What does it say about communities that do not display the indicators?" She said, "The doctrine's escalation protocols specify that insufficient behavioral indicators are addressed through increased pressure. The assumption is that the indicators are absent because the pressure has not reached the threshold." He said, "And the escalation increases the pressure until the threshold is reached." She said, "Yes." He said, "And if the threshold is not where the doctrine assumes it is?" She said, "The doctrine does not address that scenario." He said, "Because the doctrine was not written for a species that sings." She said, "No, it was not." He looked at the display. He thought about the inoculation framework, about the cultural analysis paper that the Civilizational Studies Division had produced from the horror genre file, about a species that had developed a cultural technology for sitting with fear in controlled conditions for generations. He thought about what happened when a species that had practiced sitting with fear for a century established a colony and then spent 11 days under orbital bombardment. He thought about whether the managed pressure doctrine had any operational purchase on beings who had built, into the foundation of their community culture, the practice of making beauty in the dark. He said, "Hold all strike sequences until further notice." Thessaly said, "All sequences, Commander." He said, "All of them." She said, "The doctrine specifies that halts of more than 12 hours require command justification." He said, "The justification is that I need to think." She said, "Yes, Commander." At 400, the time the strike sequence had been scheduled, the orbital command ship held position. The colony was dark below. At 2100 the following evening, the audio signal returned. The plaza, the heat signatures, the music. Undar was awake. He had not slept. He had spent the interim reading everything the Conclave's database had on human communal music traditions, and on human communities under stress, and on the history of siege and resistance in Earth's pre-contact period, which was a history that the database had extensively because Earth had extensively documented its own history, and the documenting had been thorough. He had read for 20 hours. He listened to the music for 47 minutes. At the end of 47 minutes, he opened a channel to his intelligence officer and said, "The song they sang last night, and tonight, it is the same song." The intelligence officer said, "The melody is the same, Commander. The performance varies." He said, "I want to know what the song is, its origin, its history, its meaning." The intelligence officer ran the search. The result came back in 11 minutes. The intelligence officer said, "Commander, the song is documented in Earth's cultural archive. It is several hundred years old. It was written in a period of significant conflict in Earth's pre-contact history by a community of people who had been displaced from their home and were living under difficult conditions." She said, "The song's original language is not the standard human lingua franca. It is from one of Earth's regional linguistic traditions. The translation of the title is approximate." He said, "What is the approximate translation?" She said, "The approximate translation is something between 'we shall overcome' and 'we will get through this,' and 'we are not done yet.' The translation is approximate because the original word does not have a direct equivalent in standard conclave language." She said, "The research literature on this specific song is extensive. It has been significant in human cultural and political history across several centuries. It has been used repeatedly as a communal expression in contexts of resistance, hardship, and collective determination." She said, "It was written by people who had lost their home and were surviving difficult conditions, and it has been sung by human communities in difficult conditions for several hundred years since." Undar said, "They brought a several hundred-year-old song to a colony 23 years ago." The intelligence officer said, It appears to be one of the songs that travels with human communities, that they carry from one place to another. He said, why that song? She said, the research literature suggests it functions as what one researcher calls a portable home, a way of carrying a community's identity and history through conditions that threaten both. He said, a portable home. She said, yes. Undar sat with that. A portable home that was several hundred years old that a colony had carried to Keth 7 and was now singing in the plaza under an orbital reduction operation. He thought about what was in the song that made it portable. He thought about what a community carried when everything else was under threat. He thought about the research literature's description of the song's origin. People who had lost their home and were surviving difficult conditions, and had written something that other people in other difficult conditions had been singing for several hundred years since. He thought about the managed pressure doctrine and the 14 previous reductions and the capitulation timeline, and everything the doctrine had assumed about the relationship between pressure and stopping. He thought about a species that had been writing songs for situations like this since before they had writing. He said, Thessaly. She said, Commander. He said, I want to speak with the colony's leadership. She said, we have no established communication channel. He said, establish one, broadcast on the same frequency they used for the music, the open audio band. She said, you want to open communication on the music frequency. He said, yes. She said, the doctrine specifies that communication during reduction operations is conducted through formal capitulation channels. He said, I know what the doctrine specifies. She said, yes, Commander. She established the channel. Undar opened it. He said, this is Commander Veth Undar of the Valith Dominion Orbital Reduction Command. I am addressing the leadership of the Keth 7 colony on the open audio band. I would like to speak with you. The channel was quiet for 40 seconds. Then a voice came through. It was a woman's voice, not young, the voice of someone who had been in a difficult situation for 11 days and who was not going to pretend that was not the case, and who was also not going to let the difficulty be the first thing communicated. She said, this is Administrator Sira Dayan. I am the colony's elected administrator. I am available. Undar said, Administrator Dayan, I want to ask you something. She said, yes. He said, the music, 2 nights the same song. She said, yes. He said, why? She was quiet for a moment. She said, because it is what we do. When things are hard, we sing. He said, the song is several hundred years old. She said, yes. He said, you brought it to a colony 23 years ago. She said, we bring it everywhere. It is one of the things we bring. He said, why that song specifically? She said, because the people who wrote it knew something about being in a situation that felt impossible and continuing anyway. They put what they knew into a song, and the song carries it. When you sing it, you are not alone with the thing you are in. You are with everyone who has been in something like it and continued. She said, it is a way of being with people who are not here anymore. People who were in the impossible situation and continued, and wrote a song about it so that the people who came after them would know it was possible. She said, the continuing is possible. The song says so. A lot of people have sung it. The singing says it is true. Undar was quiet for a moment. He said, Administrator Dayan, the managed pressure operation, the doctrine's intended outcome. She said, we know what the intended outcome is. He said, you know. She said, yes. He said, and. She said, and we are not there yet. He said, the doctrine's escalation protocols. She said, we know about those too. He said, and. She said, and we are not there yet. He said, when will you be there? She said, I do not know. I do not think there is a there. I think we are in a different situation than your doctrine was written for. He said, explain. She said, your doctrine was written for communities that assess the cost of continuing against the cost of stopping and choose stopping, when the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of stopping. She said, we do not do that calculation the same way. He said, how do you do it? She said, we calculate what we are if we stop, not just what it costs to stop, what we become. She said, if we stop here, we become the community that stopped. We become the place in the song where the singing ended. And the song has been going for several hundred years, and the people in the impossible situation wrote it so that the people who came after them would know it was possible to continue. And if we stop here, we break something in the song. She said, we cannot break the song. Andar said nothing for a moment. He thought about portable homes and songs that carried people through impossible situations, and what a community was if it stopped in the middle of the thing that defined it. He thought about a doctrine written for communities that did the cost calculation and found the threshold. He thought about a species that had been in the impossible situation long enough to write songs about it that had been sung for several hundred years, and that had been carried to a colony 23 years ago, and were being sung in a plaza under an orbital reduction operation. He said, Administrator Dan, I am going to be honest with you. She said, please. He said, I have been running this operation for 11 days. The doctrine predicts outcomes that have not occurred. I have been revising my assessment. She said, yes. He said, the fourth revision brought me to a place where the doctrine does not have a prescription. She said, what place? He said, the place where I am asking a colony that I have been bombarding for 11 days while they are singing. She said, and we told you. He said, yes. He said, Administrator, I want to tell you something about what happens next. She said, yes. He said, I do not yet know what happens next. I know that I am holding all strike sequences while I determine what happens next. I know that the determination is going to take longer than the doctrine anticipated because the doctrine did not anticipate this situation. She said, what situation specifically? He said, the situation where the community I am trying to reduce is not reducible by the means the doctrine specifies, because the community is not organized around the things the doctrine assumes communities are organized around. He said, your community is organized around a song. She said, among other things, but yes. He said, a song cannot be bombed. She said, no. He said, the doctrine cannot address a song. She said, no. He said, I am going to escalate this situation to Dominion Command for strategic review. I am going to recommend a hold on all strike sequences pending that review. I am going to document the reasons for the recommendation, which are that the managed pressure doctrine has reached the limit of its applicability in this situation, and that continuing to apply, it will not produce the intended outcome. She said, and in the interim. He said, in the interim, I would ask that the colony refrain from any activity that could be interpreted as an escalation from your side. She said, we are singing. He said, yes. She said, is that an escalation? He thought about that. He said, no. He said, that is not an escalation. You may continue. She said, thank you, Commander. He said, Administrator Dan, the song, I would like to hear it again. She said, tonight at 2100. He said, I will be listening. The channel closed. He transmitted the recommendation to Dominion Command at 600. The recommendation was 4 pages. It described the 11 days and the 3 revisions and the music and the open audio band and the 4th revision and the communication with the administrator and the portable home and the several hundred years and the song that could not be bombed. It said at the end, the Keth 7 colony does not fit the managed pressure doctrine's operational assumptions. The doctrine was designed for communities that calculate the cost of continuing against the cost of stopping and choose stopping when the threshold is reached. The Keth-7 colony does not operate on a threshold model. It operates on an identity model. The community continues because stopping would change what the community is, and the community has decided that changing what it is not an available option. The recommendation said, the managed pressure doctrine has no mechanism for addressing an identity model community. Escalation will increase cost but will not produce threshold crossing because there is no threshold. The community will absorb the increased cost and continue to sing. The recommendation said, I am recommending a strategic review of the Keth-7 situation and a suspension of managed pressure operations pending that review. I am further recommending that the review include consultation with the Conclave Civilizational Studies Division regarding the specific cultural and psychological characteristics of human colonial communities under stress, as the existing intelligence profile for this colony was insufficient for accurate operational assessment. It ended, I have been listening to the colony sing for 2 nights. Tonight will be the 3rd night. I intend to continue listening. I believe the listening is more operationally relevant at this point than anything the doctrine specifies. Dominion Command received the recommendation at 800. The strategic review was convened at 1000. At 2100 that night, in the plaza of the colony on Keth-7, the heat signatures gathered. The audio signal began. On the orbital command ship, Andar listened. His senior staff listened with him, not because he had asked them to, because Thessaly had told them what was happening and they had gathered on the bridge and stood at their stations and listened. The song was the same song. Different performance, same song. The voices of people who had been under bombardment for 11 days and had decided that the bombardment was not the thing that defined them. The song lasted 47 minutes. At the end, Thessaly said, Commander. Andar said, yes. She said, Dominion Command has approved the strategic review. The hold on strike sequences is confirmed pending review. He said, yes. She said, the review is expected to take 4 weeks. He said, yes. She said, what happens in 4 weeks? He said, I do not know. He said, I know that whatever the review produces it is going to have to account for the song. She said the song. He said, the review is going to produce a recommendation. The recommendation is going to produce a decision. The decision is going to produce an action. And whatever action is taken, it is going to have to account for the fact that a community that is singing a several hundred-year-old song about continuing through impossible situations cannot be reduced by the means the doctrine specifies, because the means the doctrine specifies have no operational purchase on a song. He said the song is still there. Whatever we decide, the song is still there. Thessaly said, yes. He said, and they will sing it tomorrow night, and the night after. She said, yes. He said, and the night after that. She said, probably yes. He looked at the planet below, at the colony, at the plaza where the heat signatures were dispersing. He thought about portable homes and songs that traveled in communities that decided that stopping was not an available option, because stopping would change what they were. He thought about what it meant that a species had built into the foundation of its communities the practice of singing together in the dark, until the dark was no longer the thing that defined the moment. He thought that the managed pressure doctrine had been written for 14 different situations, and had worked for all 14, and had not been written for a 15th situation, because the 15th situation was a species that had been in impossible situations for 11,000 years, and had developed, across those 11,000 years, the specific cultural infrastructure for remaining itself, while the impossible situation did what impossible situations did. The song was the infrastructure. The song was older than the colony, older than the species' presence in space, old enough to have been written by people in an impossible situation that was over now, that had ended, that the people who had been in it had continued through and come out the other side of, and left behind a song so that the people who came after them would know it was possible. The song said it was possible. The colony was singing it. The orbital reduction operation was on hold. And somewhere in the command structure of the Valeth Dominion Strategic Review, 4 weeks of people looking at the recommendation and the situation and the doctrine, and the thing that the doctrine had not been written for would produce a decision. Andar did not know what the decision would be. He knew that whatever it was, the colony would sing tomorrow night. He knew that the singing would continue. He knew that a song several hundred years old, carried from Earth to Keth 723 years ago, had done something that 11 days of managed pressure had not done, which was to produce a moment where the orbital reduction operation held, and the commander of the operation listened and asked why, and received an answer that the doctrine did not have a category for. He thought that was not nothing. He thought that was maybe the whole thing. He filed his end-of-day operational log. The log said, Day 12, strike sequences on hold, colony status unchanged, community cohesion indicators remain high, music performance at 2147 minutes, same song as previous evenings. He added one line that was not standard operational log language, and that he included anyway, because the log was supposed to be accurate. The line said, the song is getting better. He closed the log. He went to find something to eat. Tomorrow night he would listen again.